All right, thank you for the short break there. I got just a couple of goodies to bring out here. So my presentation is obviously entitled Winlink in a Box, and that is the sort of big project to share here. But I also just want to make this sort of a love letter to ham radio, because I've been in the hobby for about 3 years, and it's actually pretty amazing some of the things that I never would have expected to get into. But the hobby has, forced me to sort of stretch my boundaries. And so with that introduction, let's get into it. I am Chris, K0SWE. I'm active in Aries, I'm active in RMHAM, and I'm also a software engineer, so I try and do some software work for the hobby. So one of the first things that I really caught on to when I was getting into ham radio was Winlink. It seemed like a really cool technology. It didn't occur to me before getting into the hobby that you could send emails over the radio. That's something you can do with a cell phone, but you can do that with ham radio. That's pretty cool. So I ended up trying to find like the least expensive way of trying to do that. And I ended up with this TNC Pi on top of a Raspberry Pi here. And I went about trying to make a recipe for building one of these that was, straightforward. And I ended up calling that set of directions PiPat. It uses a Winlink client called PAT. It's a cross-platform Winlink client, unlike Winlink Express. PAT is pretty powerful. It's still missing a few things here and there. But the nice thing about this is you can just power it on and pull out your smartphone, and this thing is putting out its own Wi-Fi access point. So you can connect a smartphone up, get on a web page, type out your Winlink email and hit send, and it'll do the rest. So, that's kind of cool. You don't need an entire laptop. You don't need an entire mobile station. All you need is this plus an HT. That's not bad. Unfortunately, what I found was that, for one thing, these TNC Pis got discontinued. Coastal Chipworks was making these things, and they ended up going out of business. You can now pick these, you can pick up the same type of chip, the same type of board from MFJ, I believe they partnered with to keep these going. But it's really pretty expensive for what this board can do. This is using pretty old Bell tone decoders in the hardware. And actually, it's not that great at decoding, is what I've kind of found through trial and error. You actually get much better decode performance from one of these. This is a sound card interface. A lot of people will recognize it. This is a really popular one. SignalLink USB. You plug it into a computer on one end, plug it into a radio on the other end, and it just sends sound directly to the computer. And so with this, you can run a software TNC. There's a couple of them out there. There's one called Sound Modem, and there's one called Direwolf. And they both work pretty darn well. They both work better than the Bell decoder hardware. And so a lot of people use these. They're nice, small, rugged, do a lot of good things. So I ended up, for most of my VHF Winlink stuff, I ended up using this a lot. All right, so yeah, sound card interfaces. I started using these for Winlink. And then finally, I got my first HF station, and I got on HF and started doing digital modes there, like FT8 and JS8. What else? What is it? JT31, PSK31. Thank you. And JT's. Yes. Yeah, we got people rattling off all the acronym soup here. And this worked really well for my base HF station. But then I got into QRP HF, which was actually really nice in my case because at home all I can do is a long wire antenna, and it really wasn't an optimal setup. When I was doing QRP, I could get out into a park, I could set up a really nice optimal antenna, and actually all of my DX contacts so far have been on that QRP station. I didn't need power, I just needed a better antenna. Problem with going to that QRP station was I needed this mess in order to do digital modes. You know, you've got the sound card here, you've got the cat cable, and if you've only got one good USB port on your laptop, you also need the hub here, and this is just a mess, right? We could do better than this. So I set about into my first really big hardware project. I'd done just a little bit of hobby electronics before this. You know, I'd messed around with Arduinos and stuff like that. But I'd never really done a really complicated board design. So I went about trying to learn that and ended up with this design, which is just this in a box. It's got the sound card, it's got the serial port, and it's got the hub. But this is ruggedized, this is all in one box. I can take this out for SOTA activations. I can toss this around. I don't care what it does. I'm not going to break it off like this thing. I set out figuring this would not be too difficult. All you have to do is throw 3 chips in a box, right? But this was my first surface mount design ever, and so you know, it took me a lot of iteration and a lot of trial and error to actually come up with a finished product on this. It took about 6 months. But this was a lot of fun to do. I would have never, before I got into ham radio, I would have never dreamed of trying to do a board design like this. So I gained skills, I gained some knowledge about the rest of the world, and that's pretty cool. Shortly after I finished this was roughly June, I came across this little guy. These are sold by a guy named Dennis, K0TX out of Grand Junction. And this is the same thing. So it's about a quarter the size. Does the same thing. And he sells them for, I don't know, 40 bucks, which is much better than I got on my bill of materials. But I'm still happy that I went through the exercise of building my own sound card interface because, you know, it was still a good experience. And at the moment, I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with this. In certain situations, I'm finding the sound card on this guy will reset at inopportune times. But now I have some actual skills at trying to figure out what's going on here. I have introduced myself to an oscillator, an oscilloscope. You know, I've started to gain some skills with an O-scope, and I can actually start to understand what's going inside of here. So that's pretty cool. All right, so that brings me up to what this talk is actually purported to be about. I've switched back from HF to working on Winlink. Now, I mentioned the PAT Winlink client is still missing a few features. One of the big features that we're still missing is vara support. Vara is a digital transport that is just blowing up right now. Everyone's using it. Everyone's dropping RDOP, and Winmore is long dead. The only thing that really competes with vara at all is PACTOR, and that requires really expensive hardware. So if we can get vara support into PAT, that's going to be a huge win. So what I've been doing for the last few months is dragging around like 2 entire Winlink stations to try and, I've got to have a client and I've got to have a server, and I've got to be able to see if they're talking to each other. So I'm dragging around a ton of hardware, and I thought to myself, why don't I just box one of these up so I don't have to mess with it? Because every time I have to put one of these stations together, I've got to retune all the knobs. I got to, figure out all the gain levels and start up all the hardware and start up all the software in the correct order. And it's just a pain in the ass, right? So that brings me to the actual subject of the talk, Winlink in a box. This is a complete Winlink station. Inside here you've got an HT of your choice. I happen to have the very, very inexpensive, do not use this anywhere except test Baofeng. It is a tower radio, as in if you drop it off the tower, you don't care that it gets broken. You got the HT. It's set to constantly on so that anytime there's power to the box, the HT turns on. I got the Raspberry Pi in here. This is set up when it boots. It boots Vara, it boots LinBPQ. It could be set up to boot PAT instead. But this turns on and it just works. We got a sound card interface in here. This turns on, it just works. I take this out to wherever I'm working for the day, plug it into a power pole, and it just works. It hooks up to Wi-Fi if it knows of one nearby. It starts up its own access point if there are no networks that it knows of, so at least I can get into it. And a lot of the lessons that went into this I learned from building PAT, 2 years ago, or PiPat 2 years ago. All the same lessons went into building this. Of course, in the process of building this thing, I've got ideas for where I could go next. Because I've got the Raspberry Pi in here, and it's hooked up to a sound card interface, but what if I could simplify that whole setup? Turns out you can buy, I don't have the actual module here, but you can buy a Raspberry Pi compute module, which is the Raspberry Pi without any of the connectors. Instead of USB and HDMI and all those other connectors on the side that you may or may not use, it's got these two sub-micro connectors. You probably find them in a cell phone or something. And you can build a board to split out whichever ports you actually want. And you can build something on the side here like a sound card interface and a serial interface. And what if we want to throw on a GPS on there? What if we want to throw backup power on there? Now that I have the skills to build a custom board, and now that I have good experience configuring these Raspberry Pis, I'm in a good position to build like a custom thing that just does digital modes for amateur radio. We could configure it for Winlink. We could configure it for FT8. The possibilities are endless as long as we're using a Raspberry Pi. So this might end up being one of my next projects, is trying to figure out how to build a amateur radio thing for Raspberry Pi.
So I have a question.
Sure.
You said that you are running Vara on a Raspberry Pi.
Yes.
How is that?
Through very tricky means. I did not figure this out. Someone has figured this out in the last 6 months or so. There is an emulator for the ARM architecture up to 386 architecture that's called Box 86. On top of that, you run Wine to go from Linux 386 to Windows 386. So you've got Box 86 and you've got Wine, and all of a sudden you can run Vara on top of a Raspberry Pi.
I think it would be kind of neat if EA5 VHK would actually put out a call to folks to do a hardware implementation of Vara? Don't you think that would be kind of cool?
That would be really, really nice.
We've
Yeah.
been talking about this for a long time, and there's no reason that that couldn't be done, because the way software works, you have to buy a key to run the software. Why don't you have to buy a key to run the hardware? Makes sense to me. It's
Yeah.
pretty simple, and it's not rocket science to try to implement it. It would be wonderful if the folks that did that would think about it, because there's no reason that we're software bound on this. Windows is crap. And anytime you're going to put a piece of Windows software on a mountaintop with radio equipment, it's just a bad idea.
Yeah. I mean, that is fair. And this is working around the fact that, we're limited in what we can do with Vara, just because the creators either haven't gotten around to it or are not interested in these applications that we're trying to set it to. There's a lot that we could do with, a separate piece of software that would run Vara headless. There's a lot we could do with hardware that would run Vara. And at the moment we're just working around this as best we can. So I'm happy that we have workarounds, but it would be awesome to move this forward, actually. This was kind of a rambling set of projects here, but the point is, amateur radio is the family that I never knew I wanted to have. When I thought about amateur radio, I thought guys talking on the repeaters about weather. And there's so much more to it. This is an entire, problem space to explore. You can go off in any direction you want and find new ways to contribute, new places to experiment. It's just a gold mine of stuff that we can try out for the first time. You can be an amateur scientist and contribute to the body of knowledge. You can be an amateur engineer and pick up board design for the first time, and that's really cool. I've learned so many skills that I never thought I would pick up just because I joined this hobby and this community. So I'm very thankful to having found this little corner of the universe. If you have any questions, I am K0SWE at ARRL.net. Questions?